It triggered months of upheaval. Now Ukraine has finally signed that trade deal with the European Union. But Russia is strongly against it. Will it bring Kiev closer to Europe? And what will it mean for the rebellion in the east? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zaidan. Now, Ukraine's new president, Petro Poroshenko, has signed a cooperation agreement with the European Union. The deal will free up trade with the EU, offering greater access to the huge European market, but it also means closer cooperation in energy and foreign policy. In return, Ukraine must meet European standards on human rights and democracy, strengthen the rule of law and fight corruption. Well, all this could eventually lead to Ukraine possibly joining the EU. But it was, let's remember, the very refusal to sign this deal that set off the crisis in Ukraine, the toppling of the president, the loss of Crimea and, of course, the rebellion in the east. Well, now Moscow is not taking this lightly, as you'd think. It's already warning there'll be what it calls grave consequences for the government in Kiev. Well, President Poroshenko has hailed the agreement as the most important move since his country's independence. But he does have some concerns.
I think this is the most important day for Ukrainian history after Independence Day. The only thing who can make a problem for us is the problem of security. You know that at the present time, Ukraine are under attack. And my first step after inauguration was coming to Donbass and presented there on Donetsk and Lugansk region peace plan of the President Poroshenko, which I promised during the campaign. And significant elements of this peace plan is decentralization of power, is defending the right of the Russian-speaking people speaking of any languages they want on the regional level.
Well, as we just mentioned, it was the reversal of a similar agreement that saw Ukraine spiral into chaos. Back in November, then President Viktor Yanukovych blamed pressure from Moscow on that decision. And of course, we had months of protests by pro-EU demonstrators. The protests gained pace, but a violent crackdown by security forces led to the deaths of 88 people. It was one of the worst days of violence in almost 70 years. Well, just 2 days later, Yanukovych fled the country as Parliament scrambled to appoint an interim leader. Later, as pro-Russian protests grew in strength, Crimea voted to leave Ukraine in a hastily organized referendum. That process ended with it becoming part of the Russian Federation. Well, early in April, pro-Moscow activists began occupying government buildings in the east, touching off months of sporadic fighting between pro-Russia separatists and Ukrainian forces. It was only last week that a fragile ceasefire was finally declared. People in Ukraine have been positive about the agreement. Let's hear what some of them had to say, at least.
We are together against Putin. We love Russians and despise Putin.
Europe has been living under the rule of law much longer, and I think we will take the best practices from them. I will also add proudly that we need to go to Europe, and we must be friends with Europe. We are Europe. Ukraine is Europe.
What's
positive is, first of all, support from the economies of European countries. It's a support we've long waited for. It may also mean signing of additional agreements about support of our territorial integrity by the European Union countries.
It's important, it's a victory, but it came with a very high price, a very, very high price.
Let's bring our guests in now to discuss the issue. From Brussels, Amanda Paul. She is a policy analyst with the European Policy Centre who specialises in Ukraine-EU integration. In Kiev, Oleksiy Haran, Professor of Comparative Politics at the University of Kiev Mohyla Academy. And finally, Alexei Vedev, who is the Director of the Center for Structural Studies with the Institute of Transitional Period. He joins us from Moscow. Let's start with Kiev and with Mr. Oleksiy Haran. The new president certainly looked happy there as he was signing the agreement. Are you celebrating as well today?
Yeah, and I think people in Maidan are celebrating, and this is really the victory for Ukraine, because the agreement was prepared for almost a decade by different governments and different presidents. I would like just, to correct one thing about what happened in Crimea and in the east of the country, because in Crimea it was direct intervention of Russia.
Okay,
and
sorry,
it was
Alexei,
annexation
I understand
by Russia.
there are a lot of perspectives
That's
on this.
very important.
Let's keep the discussion, if we could, focused on going forward and today's agreement rather than the past, if we could. Let me bring in Alexei Vedev from Moscow.
No, it's not. It's not past.
Okay.
It's what we have now.
Nevertheless,
we have undeclared war from Russia.
Right. Let's talk about the agreement, though. If I could bring Alexei into the discussion. From your understanding and contacts and research with people in the East, is everybody celebrating in Ukraine today?
Are you asking me?
No, that question I said, sir, for Mr. Alexei in Moscow.
Yes. Good day. I'm strongly hesitate that this is good news for eastern part of Ukraine, and for Crimea it's a neutral news, because now Crimea are on the way to integrate to the Russian economy. So my prediction is that Crimea economy will be more or less stable in the next 3 years. But for east part of Ukraine, I think it's bad news. It will be a problem.
Why is it bad news? I mean, we've heard from Mr. Alexei in Kiev. A lot of people are happy. This is the day they've been waiting for. What could there possibly be to make you unhappy on this day?
I think the movement to the Europe, maybe it's too early for eastern part of Ukraine to move so fast to the Europe. Because it's metallurgy, it's all the economy, it's hard, big enterprises in the east part of Ukraine. They are traditionally oriented to the Russian economy. They incorporated, and the Russian economy, it's the biggest demand for the production of Ukrainian economy.
Okay.
So I think that eastern part is not ready for cooperation.
Okay, you've made that point. Let me bring in Alexei Haran from Kiev. I could see you're angling to get in. Please go ahead, sir.
Yeah, it's interesting. Definitely it's interesting to hear how my Russian colleague is commenting the events in Ukraine. But let me comment the events in Ukraine from Ukrainian perspective. And again, if we are talking about the east of the country, we understand that the country needs reforms, including the east of the country. But it's difficult to do reforms when you have undeclared war from Russia. I would like to stress it again. This is so-called hybrid war, when Russia is using mercenaries, troops, different weapons which is coming from the Russian border. This is an aggression. Again, as to Crimea, this was the first case of annexation in Europe after World War II. So definitely it's difficult to do reform and at the same time to resist Russian aggression. But that's what we are going to do. We are going to do reforms within the country, and we are going to defend the security of the country.
Okay.
And we are to rely on we hope for support from our Western partners as well.
Okay.
But again, it's important to understand that we have unprovoked aggression from Russian side.
Okay, Alexei, you've made that point several times. Let me bring in Amanda Paul from Brussels. You know, there's obviously, if you look at the thing from the perspective in Kiev, there's a lot of hope riding on this agreement. Let's get a bit of a reality check. Is this agreement simply about business, or is this the beginning of setting a path for Ukraine to join the EU?
Well, I mean, it's not just about business. The agreement is a historical agreement. It's going to bring Ukraine much closer politically and economically towards the EU. And as I think it was President Barroso said today, the agreement doesn't mean the end of the road. Ukraine can go further, and hopefully it will end in membership of Ukraine in the EU, with something which Mr. Poroshenko referred to today. Of course, this is not around the corner. It's going to take an awful lot of political will and momentum both from the Ukrainian side and from the EU. So this is many years down the road, but I think the EU should make a much stronger signal. It should give an explicit promise to Ukraine. This will help the process, but I don't think anybody should think Ukraine will be joining in the next couple of months or years. It's a long-term perspective.
Do you think it was a good move to make this agreement at this point in time, with everything that's going on in Ukraine, when the ability of the president to speak for everybody in Ukraine is being questioned or challenged?
I mean, first of all, President Poroshenko was elected with a massive majority, despite the fact that, you know, some people in 2 regions of Ukraine couldn't vote. I mean, Ukraine showed themselves to be unified and together in the issue of where they see Ukraine's future as part of Europe. I think actually this agreement should have been signed a long time ago. I think the EU are guilty of keeping the process much too slow. They should have given Ukraine this sort of commitment many years before. Perhaps if they had done, we may not have had to go through as many difficult obstacles and scenarios as we have.
All right, if I could bring Oleksiy in from Kiev, Mr. Oleksiy Haran. How will the country implement reforms when it's divided? Can you really move towards a common market with the European Union when your own market is divided?
Well, I think, well, it's not correct to say. What do you mean by market is divided?
Well, your country is divided, isn't it?
Okay, and no, the country is not divided. Actually, this is, again, this
well,
is
Russian there are rebels in the east who are rebelling, are there not? There are people in the east who are rebelling against Kiev.
Listen, no. Even in 2 oblasts, in Donetsk and Lugansk, half of these regions is controlled by Kiev, and only half is controlled by separatists which are supported by Russia. If you analyze the polls, all the polls show that even in the east of the country, most people are in support of strong, united Ukraine, and they do not have desire to secede from Ukraine. So here basically I would fully support what Amanda Paul said from Brussels. Mr. Poroshenko was elected with, in 1 round, by a majority of Ukrainians. Half of Lugansk Oblast region is also voted, took part in the election. So basically you have now, more or less, you have consensus on the geopolitical orientation of the country. Again, if there were no infiltration from Russia, there would be no conflict in the east, because Ukrainians during the period of its independence, they showed that we are ready to find compromises, and the compromises are on the table, and the compromises were proposed before Poroshenko was elected and now after he was elected. So again, we Ukrainians can find compromises and agreement on our future unless there is interference, and interference from abroad.
Mr. Oleksiy, let me ask you the question. Do you concede that there are some Ukrainians who are not happy with the way the government in Kiev is handling affairs and is rebelling, or do you consider that there is not a single pure Ukrainian who is rebelling in the east?
Okay, I understand the question. Listen, there are some people in the east of the country, and by east I mean 2 regions, Donetsk and Lugansk, who hold the separatist view. There are such people.
Okay, having said that, allow me to then ask you a follow-up question. No, sorry, if you could allow me to ask a follow-up question to that. If you accept that there are people who, however much territory they are in control of some parts of the country, however big or small, who are not happy with the way that the Kiev government is running things, how can the Kiev authorities assert its control in imposing reforms and the sort of process that the European Union might expect from Kiev to impose throughout the country? That's my simple question.
Okay. First of all, we need to stop the conflict, okay? In order to stop the conflict, the ceasefire was proposed. The peace plan is on the table, okay? So there is potential for political negotiations. Again, we can talk to those people who call themselves separatists unless when these talks are political, not military. It's not possible to talk to people who are terrorists. And, you know, it's common practice in the world. So the government in Kiev is ready to talk. There is a proposal on decentralization. It's under discussion. The regions will receive a lot of additional rights. And that's the clue to the issue.
All right, let's bring
I would like also to stress that even in any democracy, there are different views. There are different views on
Of course there are different views,
issues.
but taking up arms and wresting
for,
control of territory from a state, of course, is another matter that doesn't usually, one hopes, happens in democracies. Anyway, let's move on to Mr. Alexei. If we could, let's bring in Mr. Alexei from Moscow now. How might Russia respond to this? It's been talking about grave consequences. What sort of steps might Moscow be contemplating now?
So I think politically Russia should be extremely neutral now, because of course the talks should be on the way, and I think objective the Russian position now is quite neutral.
Is it really neutral when they're talking about imposing grave consequences, calling one of the advisors making terms, one of the advisors to Putin is calling the Ukrainian leader a Nazi? That doesn't sound like neutral, does it?
I think neutral in this conflict, because of course traditionally we support the eastern part of Ukraine, but now I think Russian leaders should do anything to support the talks between two sides.
Okay, but let me take this scenario for example. If Russia doesn't, for example, it's been said now, reimpose duties on Ukrainian exports, there is the possibility after this agreement between Kiev and Brussels that Kiev could re-export EU goods into Russia tax-free and flood the Russian market and economy. Is that not one example of something that's going to build this pressure on Russia to try and reimpose restrictions?
Of course, introduce the duties, the new duties affect the eastern economy of east part of Europe, and it's quite a difficult choice for Russian economic policy, because of course now we are on free duty trading, both Ukraine and Russia, and of course after the movement to European Union we should change our policy, our trade policy. And even now I think the Russian economy will rise, will go out from stagnation this year because of import substitution, and this process just beginning now. And of course it will be a great problem for eastern Ukrainian economy. Import substitution in intermediate goods, in military parts of military goods, and so on.
All right, Amanda Paul in Brussels, you had it there, it seems from Alexei as well, the possibility that Russia might have to review some of its policies, trade policies towards Ukraine. What would that do to the Ukrainian economy? One figure I read, I think for 2013, was 24% of Ukrainian exports going to Russia.
I think it's been, explained, many times over and over by representatives of the European institution and others that Ukraine can continue to have relatively normal economic and trade ties with Russia. There's nothing within the DCFTA which prevents them from having that. It's just that the Russians themselves have an all or nothing approach and are putting obstacles in the path to create, this very ugly situation that we have now. I mean, the problem with Russia is that, if I might say so, it behaves like a husband who is beating its wife as a way to keep the wife with it, only it has the opposite effect, and the wife runs away anyway. If the Russians changed their approach, I think they would have a much more constructive relationship or dealings with Ukraine and other countries
my question, Amanda,
in the region.
Really, if the wife runs away, to use your analogy, and she loses 24% of her income, that's still a problem, regardless of how good or bad you think the husband is. How will Kiev deal with that, or how will Brussels help Kiev to deal with that?
Well, I mean, the EU, Brussels, has promised to economically support Ukraine. What that's actually going to amount to in the long term remains to be seen, because, as we know, the EU is still suffering from the economic crisis. So I think we're going to have to say that, as with other integration projects, of course, there's going to be some economic hardships in the short term, but in the medium to long term, Ukraine will benefit. But I'm afraid you have pain before the glory. And that's how this is probably how it's going to be in this case as well.
Pain before the glory. Mr. Alexei in Kiev, will that glory be shared by everyone? If Russia's trade relationship with Kiev is impacted because of this deal, will it not be actually the east of Ukraine which will be impacted the worst?
Listen, the problem of the East is not of association agreement with the EU. The problem of the East is that it has unmodernized industry, which is inherited from the Soviet time. And it was time long ago to start modernization of this industry. So actually here, Ukraine is not unique. We are to follow what has been already done by Poland, by Baltic countries, by Slovakia, by Romania, and other countries which now are members of the EU. So we do not have actual alternatives. The alternative is either we have reforms and we are joining the club of civilized nations which share European values, freedoms, and market values, or we are to join Russian-led customs union, which is the union of dictators. So this is a choice, and I believe what has been done quite recently in Russian-Ukrainian relations by Mr. Putin showed to many Ukrainians that our choice should be Europe, not the customs union led by Russia. So, you know, there's no alternative actually.
Okay, there's no alternative, but you talked about a modernization program which is necessary. I guess my question is, when you look at the majority of the exports that are going from Ukraine to Russia, they're things like base metals, machinery, equipment, a lot of which is manufactured in eastern Ukraine. Now, how much of a modernization program is there? How much can there be that Kiev could impose in key areas in Luhansk and Donetsk while there is, let's say, I know you don't like the word division, while there are problems in the east?
Okay, listen, maybe you should invite economists for this discussion. I am a political scientist. But let me say that, again, it's possible.
I'm talking about it from a political
Ukraine,
aspect, sir.
For other countries to
talk about it from a political aspect. Can Kiev impose its political will there?
Yes, that's what I am trying to say. We have free trade agreement with Russia. We can have free trade agreements with other countries as well. This is normal. So Russia is putting obstacles. And definitely if Russia puts obstacles to Ukraine, we need somehow to challenge it and to find the way out. Again, if you compare the situation with 1991, when Ukraine gained independence, all our industry was connected to Russia. All our industry. So compared to that, to the year of 1991, this is a huge evolution. This is a huge evolution. So our industry started to reorient. So again, we would like to have good economic relations.
I apologize.
I
do have to cut you off because we have only a minute left. I want to give a final chance to Mr. Alexei in Moscow. The basic feeling from both of our other guests is that Moscow's role here is more disruptive than constructive.
Okay. Yeah, I think my colleague is overestimated the possibilities of integration of Ukrainian enterprises. I think maybe at least 5% of enterprises, Ukrainian, especially in West Ukraine, will be successful. And maybe Lugansk and Donetsk region, they have better position, much better compared with Ukrainian agriculture. Could you compare Ukrainian agriculture and agriculture in Poland? It's completely different. It's not competitiveness. So I think that I can easily predict the not good future, quite great future for Ukraine in the next 3 years under the cooperation of and under the competition of European enterprises. I think it's overestimation of economic potential.
I'm sorry, we are running out of time, so we'll have to leave the discussion there. Let's thank our guests very much. Amanda Paul in Brussels, Oleksiy Haran in Kiev, and Alexei Vedev in Moscow. And of course, you can send us your thoughts, add your voice to the discussion at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or why not tweet us? Go to @AJ Inside Story. I'm Sami Zaidan. Thanks for watching. For now, it's goodbye.